Paul, hello there. Professor Paul Baker of Lancaster University, Linguistics. Can you give us a sentence in Polari and then translate it, please?
Ooh. Bona dig, which means nice to see your face, or just nice to see you.
What exactly is Polari?
It's a form of language. It wasn't really a full language. Most of it was spoken in English, but there were quite a few nouns, verbs, adjectives, which were sort of not English, a sort of different form of language, which was used by mainly gay men, but also drag queens, lesbians, prostitutes, in the first half or so of the 20th century, which was used for secrecy in order to hide the fact that you were gay, so you could have conversations in public spaces and other people wouldn't be able to understand what you were saying.
Where did the language originate? Because I understand people at fairgrounds used to use it, people in the merchant navy, even the criminal underclass.
Yeah, it goes back quite a long way. I mean, some people have traced some of the words in it to the sort of 16th or 17th century. There were a group of men who were called mollies at the time, who were probably kind of a very sort of early prototype of kind of gay culture in the UK, in that they had camp names for each other and they had sex with each other and they sort of hung out in bars and pubs and things like that. So that's kind of one of the earliest uses of Polari. And then there was a form of language called cant, which was around about the same time as well, which was used by criminals. And because these mollies were also criminalised by the law, they kind of ended up in prison, so they kind of picked up some of these cant words as well. And if you move on sort of towards the sort of 18th and 19th century, you start to find use of something called Polaris, which was a sort of pidgin form of Italian words, which were used by people who were involved in travelling fairgrounds and circuses, people who worked on markets, which travelled around the UK as well, entertainers, and also beggars used it as well. So you start to find the words relating to forms of entertainment, music, things to do with lodgings and money and numbers, things like that, all starting to be used by these groups of people who don't really have anywhere to live. They're sort of travelling around all the time, and they're kind of on the edge of society. They're sort of stigmatised in a way. So they're kind of grouping together in some ways for protection, and they're developing their own form of language. And out of that, you start to get Polari, which develops from the music halls of the 19th century, gay men particularly working in things like the chorus lines, or gay men working in the merchant navy as well, particularly in dockland areas such as the East End of London or different docks around the Mediterranean. So you have all these different sorts of influences coming together, different types of people, all of them marginalised in some way, all of them quite itinerant, and together they start to create this kind of form of language called Polari.
Was it spoken by gay men and women all over the UK, or was it regional?
I think its home was probably London, and with sort of central London. There was some talk of there being sort of different varieties within London. So there was a sort of more simple version which was spoken in the West End by the people who worked in the music halls, in the shows and things. And then there was a more complex version in the East End, which was much more influenced by the docks. So I think London was definitely its home, but I have heard of people who were speaking it in Liverpool, which also has a connection with docks, Manchester, which was another big city, even some Scottish cities, Newcastle, places like that as well. And
within that, would there have been regional variations as well as within London, do you think?
Definitely. I mean, wherever you go, even within one city, there will have been regional variations. It was very much a sort of a spoken secret language. It was not really written down. It was kind of small groups of people speaking it. And they were constantly developing it and ad-libbing it, inventing new words, particularly as some of the old words got discovered. So they were continually having to update it by inventing new words to keep it a secret.
There's been some debate as to whether it's a language in its own right, or whether it's a dialect, or whether it's a cant or a form of gay slang. Where do you stand?
I think it's not really fully a language. I think for something to have the status of a language, you've got to really be able to talk about anything in it. So you should be able to give, say, a maths lecture in it, or a science lecture or something like that. I think it's quite hard to do that with Polari without relying on lots of English terminology anyway. So for me, it's more kind of towards a quite complex slang. For some of the speakers, they started to develop their own kind of grammatical rules with it as well, even though the grammar is quite simplified and it kind of comes across as quite telegraphic when people are speaking it. But I wouldn't say it really has full status of a language. Most people who knew maybe 20 core words, and on top of that there are maybe about 500 what I call fringe words, which would have been only known to a few speakers.
What are some of the more popular core words?
They're mainly nouns, adjectives and verbs. So we've got adjectives for evaluating things as good or bad. So bona would be good, cod would be bad, or naff, things like that. Nouns tend to describe people, parts of bodies, items of clothing and everyday things. So an omi would be a man, a palone would be a woman, a gay man would be an omi-palone, and a lesbian would be a palone omi. We've also got parts of bodies, so legs would be lallies, for example. Your face would be your ecaf, your hair would be your raya, things like that. And then we've got everyday objects. So, for example, a house would be a latti, and ergo a ship would be a latti on water. A telephone would be called the Polari pipes. A television would be a vardivision, because varda means to look at. As kind of technology kind of went apace, people invented newer words to kind of keep up with developments.
You mentioned how it was often used as a secret code by gay men. Was it also used as a way to assert one's sexuality?
I think so. I mean, it started off, I think, as a kind of secret way of communicating in public, or as a way where maybe you weren't sure that somebody was gay. So you would sort of drop a Polari word into conversation, and if they responded with one, you would know they were gay. But gradually, I think, as people became more comfortable and they were speaking it maybe in what we would call safe spaces, such as like a private bar or somewhere, it became more of a kind of way of performing a very kind of camp, working class gay identity. So people would often have entire conversations in Polari based around gossiping about people who were nearby, or evaluating their fashion sense or how attractive they were. People would also maybe have arguments in Polari as well, which would sometimes be used as kind of a form of entertainment for onlookers, where they would insult each other using increasingly complicated Polari phrases for the amusement of people who were watching.
How did people pick up Polari?
Some people who I interviewed tell me that it was actually taught to them in quite a sort of rigorous way. So when they were quite young and they first came onto the gay scene, some of the older gay men would sort of actually teach them the vocabulary and the language. And this also happened in the Merchant Navy as well. When people joined the Merchant Navy at quite a young age, the older men would sort of teach them the Polari words, and they would also christen them with what's called a camp name. So it would be sort of a female name if they were male, based upon some aspect of their identity or personality.
When was its heyday?
I think its heyday was probably around about the 1950s, after World War II ended. Particularly the 1950s are seen as quite an oppressive time to be gay, with a lot of blackmail going on. There was a view that particularly after World War II, people wanted to kind of get back to normal in some ways. So it became a very kind of heteronormative society. There was also the view that particularly around the time of the Queen's coronation in the early 50s, the police wanted to kind of clean up London and make it more respectable, because there was kind of in the public eye. So there was a lot of arrests for gay people around that time, and also blackmail, a lot of homophobic violence as well. And I think during those conditions, that was when Polari really started to flourish.
Do we have any idea of how many speakers there were of Polari?
That's a really hard question to estimate. I would probably estimate it was somewhere in the tens of thousands, maybe more, maybe even hundreds of thousands, but definitely in the tens of thousands.
You mentioned that it was spoken by gay men, but you also mentioned women spoke it. It's often seen as a very male-dominated language. Was it quite popular with women too?
I don't think it was as popular with women, although there are plenty of cases of women being interviewed who knew it and used it. I don't think maybe women mixed as much with gay men. So, for example, in London, there was the Gateways Club, on the King's Road in Chelsea, which was a lesbian club, and it was sort of more kind of ghettoised for women. Gay men had their own clubs. So I think there was probably not so much maybe mixing with gay men and lesbians as maybe there is now on the gay scene, and as a result of that, maybe not as many women knew Polari as maybe gay men.
Now, you're quite a young man. You're a university professor. You did your PhD on Polari, and you've written at least 2 books on it. How come?
Why did I choose that topic? I need to go back to when I was actually thinking about choosing a PhD topic, and at the time, the BBC had just released audio tapes of Julian and Sandy Sketches, which was a radio show in the late 1960s with 2 characters who spoke in Polari. It was a comedy show, and it was very, very popular. And I listened to these tapes. A friend had played them to me, and we found those sketches really funny. And we didn't know anything about Polari. We didn't know anybody who spoke it. I'd just come onto the gay scene myself. And so I found it quite interesting that there was this whole language which was known in the 1960s, but a few decades later it seems to have been completely gone. And I thought that was really interesting. And I thought it would be fascinating to try to find out more about it, and also to sort of keep a record of it, make a record of it, so that it wouldn't be lost altogether. I was very much aware that the people who spoke it were getting older. They were in their 60s and 70s and 80s. And if somebody didn't take the time to actually go and talk to them and get their side of the story, find out about it, they would die and it would be too late. And actually, while I was doing my research and interviewing men, sometimes it felt a bit like a race against time. In fact, 1 or 2 speakers actually did die a few weeks after I spoke to them. So I really felt as if I had to get a move on and get this done quickly.
Are there any well-known speakers of Polari? I know the journalist Peter Burton, in his book, does mention it.
Yeah. The drag queen Lily Savage, who now doesn't go by that name, Paul O'Grady, he's a very fluent speaker of Polari. Julian Clary, also the comedian in the UK, also uses Polari quite a bit. I know when he won Celebrity Big Brother, for example, he tweeted it was a bona day, for example. So yeah, I'd say there are still quite well-known ones, and Kenneth Williams, obviously, from the 1960s, who was in many carry-on films and in lots of comedy shows and chat shows, as another very kind of fluent speaker of the language too.
And Peter Burton's book that I mentioned earlier was called Parallel Lives. You wrote 2 books, Polari, The Lost Language of Gay Men, and Fantabulosa, A Dictionary of Polari and Gay Slang. How challenging was it to write the books?
Well, they came out of my PhD, and it was a challenging PhD to do. Kind of having to kind of learn a whole new language and look at all of its grammar and phonetics and morphology and the social aspects of it as well from scratch. So yeah, it was quite a challenging project. One of the books is a kind of full kind of dissection of the language. Another one is a sort of more simple, kind of more fun book, more kind of stocking filler, which is basically a dictionary of the language with a short essay about it.
You mentioned Julian and Sandy, and of course they were characters in the BBC radio comedy series Round the Horne, starring Hugh Paddock and Kenneth Williams, and that brought out Polari to a wider audience. Did they get the references, the audience? Did they get the joke? Did they get the in-jokes?
I'm not sure they did. I think they knew that it was funny, and you can hear the audience laughter, and I think that's natural laughter, that's not canned laughter. I think they maybe got the gist of some of it, but maybe not some of the intricacies of it. So, for example, there's one sketch where Julian and Sandy are going into someone's home and they're cleaners, and one of them says, "Oh, I can't clean up in here. Well, the dishes are dirty," and then Kenneth Williams says, "Oh, speak for yourself." So this is kind of a pun on the word dish. He's kind of implying maybe that he's a dish. And he's not dirty, and that's probably what the audience would have got from that. But actually, dish has a kind of secondary, much more rude meaning in Polari to refer to someone's bottom. So you kind of get that there's kind of different levels of humour within that, and kind of more adept Polari speakers would have got that second level of meaning of the joke, whereas the more general audience may have got the more sort of innocent meaning of the joke there.
Round the Horne was broadcast in the 1960s. I understand that Polari started dying out in the 1970s. When did it die out, and why?
Well, homosexuality was decriminalised, I think, in 1967, which was also the same year that Round the Horne won an award for the best comedy radio show in the UK, and that was kind of the peak, I think. At that point, it didn't suddenly become really easy to be gay overnight. There was still a lot of homophobia and a lot of prejudice and a lot of people staying in the closet, but at least it removed some of the barriers to being gay. And as a result of that, towards the 1970s, you get a younger generation of gay men who haven't grown up with that same experience of fear and homophobia. You start to get concepts like gay liberation and gay pride coming out, and gay men kind of wanting to be more open about their sexuality. So the whole impetus for having a secret language sort of dies away. And then at the same time, these younger gay men, they're kind of looking at the older Polari speakers, they're seeing them as a bit politically incorrect. Not all of the Polari words are kind of nice words. It was often a language of insulting, and sometimes some of the speakers could be quite racist or sexist, which was very typical of the time compared to now. So I think people who were younger maybe viewed it as a bit old-fashioned, a bit problematic, a bit naff in itself.
Because I have heard that at times it could be racism. Sexist, you had terms like Hilda handcuffs and Betty bracelets for police officers, for instance, and people said there was an element of chauvinism amongst that. And of course, a lot of gay liberation standard a language or a camp that encouraged people to stay underground when they wanted to be out there. Do you think that played quite a big role?
Definitely. I think people wanted to kind of put all of that aside. It was in the past. It was seen as a sort of a symbol of a more oppressive time, and they wanted to move on from it. And at the same time, you've got movements such as feminist liberation movements, women's liberation. People want to remove kind of sexism from language. And Polari was seen as very feminizing as well, and it was seen as kind of creating this kind of butch camp distinction between gay men where somebody was the man and somebody was the woman. The kind of new gay men of the 1970s wanted to move away from that. So, for example, there were protests around, say, this TV sitcom Are You Being Served, which had a camp character, Mr. Humphreys, and he was protested against. I think people were maybe a bit sensitive about some of the more negative stereotypes of the time. I think they just had enough, really, and they wanted to really move on. Looking back on it, it's kind of understandable why they would do that, but I think maybe now there's a much wider set of representations of gay people, some bad, some good. So no one person kind of has to do the job of representing every single gay person. So I think there's maybe more space now for camp gay men in the media, for example, without it being seen as problematic.
Why do you think it's so important to preserve Polari?
I don't want to bring it back. I think it shouldn't be brought back, and I think it could only really come back if those kind of oppressive circumstances made it come back, and so definitely that should not happen. But I think it's a really important part of gay history. The people who spoke it, they went against what they were being told by society. If they'd kind of listened to the laws, to the public, they would have stayed at home. They wouldn't have had sex with anybody. They would have got married and been quite unhappy and made other people unhappy as well. But they didn't. They kind of found a way to cope with the fact that they were being oppressed, and they refused to kind of sit down and take it, so to speak. So they invented this language as a way of coping, and they weren't going to go away. And I think eventually the people in charge, the government, realised that they weren't going to go away, that they couldn't actually legislate homosexuality out of existence. And as a result of that, they had to start to change the law. So I think those people, even though they were working class, they weren't particularly politically minded, the fact that they just refused to go away and they refused to do what they were told means that they are kind of very important people, and without them we wouldn't have the liberation that we have today and the equality. Of
course, it's not entirely a forgotten language. It's been mentioned in popular culture. I think David Bowie and Morrissey have mentioned Polari and referred to it in lyrics. The film Velvet Goldmine, which was filmed in the end of the 90s, around 1998, that had Polari spoken in one scene. And I think a film was made in 2015 set in a park, and it was all in Polari. Why do you think there are still references to it, even though the vast majority of people won't have a clue what it is?
I think people have taken a new look at it. So I mentioned how there was this period of the 1970s and the 80s where it was seen as an old-fashioned and naff, and it kind of went into complete decline. I think as kind of we've become more comfortable with being gay ourselves as a kind of community, we're kind of looking back over people who came before us, and we're maybe being a bit kinder towards the way that we evaluate them, kind of understanding the context that they were in, and kind of taking something from that, which is interesting. It is a fascinating period of social history, a difficult time for people to have lived through, and I think there's kind of a reappraisal of that. So I think these kind of people who are remembering Polari and reevaluating it are kind of, again, not wanting to bring it back necessarily, but wanting to kind of raise awareness of it, and to say that this is part of our gay history, it's part of our culture, and it's something that shouldn't be forgotten. If anything, it should be really celebrated.
A couple more questions. Polari was very much a British thing, and particularly a London thing. Did it travel overseas much to other English-speaking nations, such as Australia or New Zealand or Canada?
Yes, I think it did. Some of the speakers of Polari were gay men. They were in the Merchant Navy, so they were travelling around, going to different countries, including Australia. Particularly once you start to get to the 60s and 70s, you've got gay men going to New York and San Francisco from the UK, picking up on the kind of subcultural models of being gay there. So I've definitely had people from America contact me to say that they know about it, and from Australia as well. I think there was actually a dentist who was Australian who named his practice after Polari a few years ago. So definitely, I think it would be known there. And I've heard that the Julian and Sandy sketches were actually played in Australia anyway in the 60s and 70s. So, gay men would have known about those things at that point.
And finally, what does the future hold for Polari?
I don't think it's going to come back, but hopefully it won't be forgotten either. I think it'll kind of exist somewhere in the middle of those two states. There's increasing interest in it. In some ways, when I was conducting my PhD research, I kind of felt I was on my own and there was not really that much interest. But it's one of those topics which, as the years have gone by, there's been constant interest in it, more and more from different types of people. So there was a few kind of media articles, people asking me to go on the radio or talk about it or write articles in magazines for it. I think the internet is certainly helping to keep it flourish as well. So for example, there was an iPhone app which was developed a few years ago where people could learn about the language and even submit new words to it. There are people who are using it to name their business after it, for example, so that's giving it public exposure. There's a literary salon in London which is named after it, and there's been an online magazine, and there's an online journal named after it too. So I think people are still kind of interested in it and adapting it. Maybe it's being used by different types of speakers now. I get the impression that now it's kind of seen as this kind of historic, almost kind of highbrow thing, because it's kind of a secret. So it tends to be maybe artists and academics and writers who are interested in it, as opposed to, say, the working class guys who were in the Merchant Navy or in the chorus line or worked as prostitutes who originally used it. So I think it's a very different type of gay man who's interested in it these days as opposed to the past. And maybe there's an issue there, I don't know. It's definitely not used in the same way, I think, as it was used in the past. But maybe that's not a bad thing. Languages are continuously developing and nobody owns them as well, so I think that's fine.
Because just before we go, there are some words that are still in the lexicon that we use, such as naff occasionally, or bevy for beverage. How come they have still remained?
I think maybe the words that have stayed around are maybe the ones that don't necessarily have a kind of a gay meaning as such. So naff, just generally means something which is not good, and you can use it in any context. And I think that's one of the words where straight people heard it. They were often the subject of being called naff. They maybe didn't understand that, but they understood it meant something bad, and they picked it up and started using it themselves. So it's kind of gained a kind of mainstream respectability. Bevy is an example of a word which was initially from Cockney rhyming slang and then borrowed into Polari. So again, I think it's one of those things where it's kind of survived because of its connection with another sort of subcultural group.
So how do you say thank you and goodbye in Polari?
Ooh, probably bona noche, which is good night, I'd say. I'm not sure about thank you.
Paul, bona noche.
Thank you.